Welcome to our briefing on COVID-19 relief spending in the United States. It's really very encouraging to see so many names, some familiar, some unfamiliar, from around the world. We're coming to you today as the invited knowledge partner of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's Global Anti-Corruption and Integrity Forum. Before we get started, before I introduce myself and my fellow panelists, I just want to say a little bit about how Crowdcast works for those of you who are not familiar with the platform. First, you'll see on the right, you have a chat function. Feel free to say nice things, to make comments, share information. But if you want to ask a question, I would refer you to the Ask a Question function that's at the sort of middle bottom of your screen. And we really encourage you to ask questions throughout. We will make sure to leave at least 15 minutes for questions from folks, ideally more. And whatever questions that we can't answer during this Crowdcast, we can actually answer afterwards. And you can also vote up some people's questions that you think are really important, you'd be very excited to see answer. So please use that function. You'll see as well a poll. The Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an international organization of 37 countries. And again, our host for this event asks that you sort of fill out what country you're from and what you do, just so we can have a sense of who came to participate today. We also have a call to action, which is actually to sign up for our weekly spotlight. This is our weekly update of what Pogo's been up to, Pogo in the news, our latest events. So please do sign up. We'd be really thrilled to have an international audience for our efforts. And so let's get started. Let me introduce myself. I'm Zoe Reiter. I am the Director for Civic Engagement at the Project on Government Oversight. We call the Project on Government Oversight Pogo, and I'm going to insist with my panelists that is the only acronym we are allowed to use today. Pogo has been around for what is now, in 2021, our 40th year. And what we do is we investigate and we expose corruption and the abuse of power. I hope you did not just hear Tilda in the background. We expose and investigate corruption and the abuse of power. And when we talk about corruption, we want to just really lay out that, unfortunately, in the United States, so much that we would define as corruption, which is the abuse of entrusted power for personal gain, is legal. So we expose that legalized corruption as well. And then we work to push for the reforms that would prevent corruption and abuse of power going forward. Increasingly, Pogo is now also working with those communities most affected by corruption and the abuse of power, both to better understand the dimensions of that corruption and abuse in their daily lives, but also to better identify solutions. So I'm very excited for us to get started. I want to introduce the two speakers today, Leslie Garvey, who's the creative director for Pogo, and in that role, she leads the organization's visual storytelling and engagement strategy. We also have Sean Moulton. Sean is our senior policy analyst at Pogo and oversees the effort to what we would call develop a blueprint for the current administration to build a more open and accountable government. Now, in this session, we will be discussing our COVID-19 spending tracker, which is the most expansive to date in the United States, and how that tracker has been used to illuminate major inequities based on available data regarding COVID-19 relief spending. So let's get into it. Sean, can you set the scene for us? When and why did Pogo decide to launch the tracker?
Well, sure. I mean, I think we decided it fairly early on in the COVID relief efforts, so almost a year ago now. Pogo's seen this before, where we spend a lot of money in a relief effort. Mostly we've seen it in the past around hurricanes or other natural disasters. And when we spend money very quickly, large amounts very quickly, we often see an increase in the corruption, the waste, the fraud, and so you need to really have a spotlight on that spending to increase the accountability around it, to avoid just wasting taxpayers' money, and really diluting your efforts. And what we saw here was, I mean, just an unprecedented scale. We're currently, so far, and it may be more, but we're currently looking at a U.S. spending on COVID relief in excess of $5 trillion. Hurricane relief is measured in billions. So now we're into the trillions and multiple trillions. And just to put that in perspective, that's more than the entire GDP for the country of Japan, which has the third largest GDP in the world. So it's an enormous amount of money. The Small Business Administration, who's been a big player in getting some of this relief out, in 2019, they had 149,000 loan transactions. In 2020, they had over 3 million. So it's really hard to go for like a 60 times increase in your workload and still provide the same level of accountability. And so what we were expecting to see was sort of an unprecedented growth in transparency and accountability around this money. And we didn't see that. Instead, we saw an administration that was dragging its feet, withholding information, not making the steps that we expected to collect additional information, to get it out quickly, to get it out in a cohesive, single place. And so we decided we may be a small nonprofit, but we're going to step in and do this on our own. And so that's how this idea behind the tracker came about. It took us a good couple of months to get off the ground, both between the data and the technology. But I think the outcome has been worth it.
Absolutely. So Leslie, can you share with the audience what went into the design of the tracker itself in terms of both who we had in mind as the user and how we approached the project?
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of building off what Sean was talking about. So I think when we were first tackling this project, like what we were trying to most broadly address was the question of like, first, where are these relief funds going? And, what data do we have to show for whether or not it's reaching those who needed it the most? So I'll start first kind of with like what we knew kind of going into the project and how that really shaped how we approached it from the design and user perspective. So we knew just from our familiarity with government data that from the outset, we would be dealing with a high volume of data, that it would be coming from multiple sources and probably not at the same time, that it wouldn't be completely consistent data across the board. And this is really challenging from like a design and database perspective. And our goal wasn't really just to bring together these kind of disparate sources of government data, right? Like from this government agency or this program. But we really wanted to marry it up to the indicators of community need that we had. So for example, Census Bureau, US Census data in terms of demographics, Bureau of Labor Statistics in terms of unemployment. And we wanted to make all of that data manipulatable in a web application that we wanted to launch really as quickly as we could, because this relief money was going out the door extremely rapidly. So to really narrow our scope and kind of tackling the project, we wanted to avoid the trap of building this web application that could just kind of do everything. And so we focused really on two end goals of a visitor coming to the site. The first, and this is what we really see as our primary audience, was the sort of power user. So experts, researchers, reporters or investigative journalists, current and former government staff, those who had like an existing familiarity with this kind of data and who really wanted to dive deep to uncover stories or develop lines of inquiry or see the bigger picture trends. The second audience we saw as like the more casual browser who is aware of the fact that we're spending this much money in the US. And this would be more of their entry point into the issue more broadly in terms of just coming to the landing page and being able to see like what's going on in my community, what's going on in my county, in my zip code, in my state, to just kind of have that entry into this issue. Because I think what we've seen is that a lot of these databases are not especially usable to somebody who doesn't have a familiarity with the data. Our thinking though is that this data would have the highest impact in the hands of the first audience, so the more specialized and smaller audience. And so we really focused most of the meat of the database in addressing those needs. So in terms of how this kind of played out in our interface, like allowing for multiple slices or views of the data. So being able to see on a like wide geographic or being able to kind of map and see this across the US. Seeing this in like a tabular view so that you would actually be able to like filter and sort and have really robust searching of this underlying data. Being able to get into the transaction details, like going from the really, really nitty gritty of what this government data actually, inherently has, and also really allowing for that bigger picture and being able to kind of back up. In terms of how this really shaped our approach, we didn't have the in-house expertise to develop and build this out ourselves. We had a team of 4 that was really most well-versed in working with this data and understanding it on a really deep level. So we were really looking for a partner that had a lot of familiarity with dealing with this kind of data in terms of, designing data dashboards or interfaces for it, especially given the volume and the data inconsistency problems we knew we would be dealing with. And that's really just such a key part of the project because, this is public information that we're dealing with. And we really wanted to not only have it in one place, but have it be really more usable. So where we ended up was we found and partnered with Fuse Lab Creative, which is a design agency actually based in the DC area. That had really robust experience with designing data dashboards. They had a lot of experience in the healthcare and medical space and had worked with some government agencies. And we actually found out that they also partner regularly with a data specialized firm, RS21, who has a lot of experience with manipulating and packaging and dealing with government data for exactly these kinds of purposes. And that partnership, I think, was just really key to how we ended up really exploring the build out, the user interface, the usability, and how we really ultimately end up releasing this product.
That's terrific, really clear, thank you. We're gonna ask Sean now to demo the site. So all of you who are tuning in can really see how this works. We won't go too deep of a dive, but we're happy to give back up, more input on how you can best leverage it at another time. But we really do want to give you a sense of what you can do with the tracker. So please go ahead, Sean. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And yes, Zoe's right. I'm not going to spend too much time digging in. I encourage everyone to go to the site and explore it on their own. I'm going to try and highlight some of its functionality and really underscore what Leslie's talking about in terms of what we were trying to build and what we hope we accomplished here. And I'm very interested, obviously, if you come up with comments or suggestions or something like that, please let us know. But so when you start out, you get this landing page, and we wanted something to just introduce people a little bit to the scope of the data, a map that shows you to some extent where the money seems to be going. I think my screen is a little zoomed out. There we go. And so you can change it and look at just loans or direct payments. It's, again, just a simple kind of landing page. And you can click on a state and get some quick information about it. But it pretty quickly takes you over to, as you'll see up here on the top, the 4 main areas, takes you over to the map function if you want, or you could have come over here where you get the ability to explore in greater detail. So some of the things I want to highlight here is in the upper right, you've got a bunch of different layers, several spending layers. You see the first 4 spending layers, all spending, sort of just assistance, just contracts, or just PPP, which is the Paycheck Protection Program. These are loans to businesses to try and maintain employment. It's certainly the biggest single program that we have in the COVID relief. But then we also have some snapshots of unemployment, overall population, and minority population percentage. So, and you really can bounce around between these different ones. Zoom back out and take a look at the state. You can change it to counties, and look at, this is contract spending, so it's a lot more sporadic. It's not most of the money. But if you change it over to assistance spending, you see almost everywhere in the country got reached. And you can change it to zip code. And again, that's going to be a little bit more sporadic. Not every area in the country has zip codes. It takes a while to fill in, as you see. So one of the other things I want to point out as interesting as, and then probably the easiest thing is to then zoom in. And as you go over, you can see the difference in some of the spending. But over here on the side panel is where we try to give people these tools to better understand the money. It'll tell you up at the top sort of a summary of what you're looking at, what you've clicked on, Nebraska, Sarpy County, what's the total spending. And then we have this scatter shot. It starts at unemployment. Along the bottom, you have spending per capita in whatever, right now by county, in just the state of Nebraska. So every time you change to a different state, it's going to change the scatter plot. And you'll see that whatever county you're on, and if I was doing zip codes, it would show those, but it'll be highlighted a different color. You can use this to find a county. And so you get to see the difference between spending per capita and then unemployment along the vertical axis here. And you can see that there's a real spread, that there are some places that got relatively less, even though their unemployment was much higher, or some counties that got quite a bit of money spending per capita. These are often the counties, I will say, that are in state capitals. We see peaks inside states at state capitals because a lot of money flows there. We don't know where it went afterwards, but it usually doesn't stay there. You can change this over to not unemployment along the vertical axis, but minority population. This is another tool we wanted to give people to explore equity, in the states, in the counties, to try and figure out if there are patterns or outliers of counties that are getting less, and that seems to be related to the ethnicity of their population. And that brings me to this bar below the scatter plot, which is the demographics of whatever area you click on. It will change. It tells you the racial demographics, the exact breakdown, of the different ethnicities. And then below that, we have the two snapshot unemployments. We're preparing to add more unemployment, I should say, to give you more of a sense of trend over time. So this is one of those things. You can go in here and you can put in, a state or a zip code. Here's why did it just disappear? Here's my county in suburban Philadelphia, Delaware County, and you see where it is. That's what people come in. They put in their zip code. They put in their county. Now, as Leslie said, we wanted to build this for experts as well, which is why we also have, if you're not just looking for these kind of aggregate kind of spending patterns, you can go into the table view. This is where you can really do filters and searches. You can look up individual recipients. You can filter by, whether it's a loan or a grant, industry sectors. You can pick particular agencies. So, this is where people come in. I always found this is my last name, and you do a search for that, and find a lot of Molten Logistics companies and Molten Tenuous, Molten LLC, not relatives of mine, but apparently some branch of the Molten family has built some pretty big companies. The one thing I'll point out here is there's this little toggle. A lot of people miss it. We default to looking at assistance. That's the vast majority of the spending, but contracts has a slightly different format to the data, so we couldn't really merge them together and make it work. And so if you're interested in COVID contracts, you really do have to toggle over, and then you have pretty much the exact same filters that you can search by. You can put in here, oh, that's not Maryland. Maryland. Why am I? And you'll get all of the contracts in a Maryland. And it starts by sorting by amount. Sorting is another function I think that it can be very useful, but you can sort by any of the other columns that we have here, zip code, city. If you're particularly interested in Baltimore and you want to see them all together, then you just click on this and it'll give you the option should give you the option. It's not giving me the option. Don't know why. All right, I'm gonna move on. The other thing I wanted to point out is that you have this little sort of magnifier glass over on the right at the end of each transaction. This gives you this little sideboard that gives you a lot more information than we can display on an individual kind of line carefully and easily. And so you'll see a lot more information. This is contracts. So it's a firm fixed price. You get an exact key, and award IDs. So it can be very useful. You can obviously download all of this information. If you do a search and you find something and you want to pull it out into a spreadsheet, then we try and give you that option. We have a limit on how many you can download, but it's a pretty big limit, so it should be useful. So I think I'll put a pin in it there. See if we can move on later to have questions. But I think that's a good demo to start.
Thanks, Sean. I think that's really helpful to give people a picture, both in detail and sort of overview of how the tracker can be used. I think it would be really helpful if you could sort of speak to how this what we've been able at Pogo to find with the tracker so far, regarding to what extent is the spending getting where it is intended. And maybe before answering that question, just for those in the audience who don't know, just speak to a little bit about what the legislation's intent was in terms of reaching underserved populations and small businesses. Thanks.
Sure. I mean, so it's a difficult question. I mean, everyone always they kind of say, are we spending money the right way? Are we spending money equitably? And it really breaks down into two different questions. The first one is who's getting the money, where's the money going, kind of thing. And we do, I think, a better job with that. I mean, it comes down to the data we're given, which there remain problems, but I think we do a pretty good job of being able to give people good answers on who's getting this money. Then there's a stickier, and that itself actually has led to some very interesting discoveries. Fraud, companies that didn't exist, people just made up companies, whole cloth, and went out and got government money. People who, some companies that got money and then turned around and gave big political contributions, which raised serious questions as to whether or not they needed federal taxpayer relief. If they were going to turn around and spend a lot of money on political contributions, they must not have been in much distress during the pandemic as a company. But then there's also the question of, did this money go to the right place? Is this equitable? Is it fair? Does it make sense? And that's where, as Leslie was saying, we tried to bring in something else to evaluate it. The census data, the unemployment data. You need to then start looking at it through a lens. And we have already, just with the tracker and the data we've brought together, we found some interesting results. One of the back end when we first launched this, we looked at the suburbs around DC. And what we found was that in the Maryland suburbs, which have a high minority population, they got a lot less per capita that we could find going to those counties than the white suburbs, the majority white suburbs in Virginia. And we also saw that in Virginia, between I think it's April and June that we have the unemployment data, the unemployment in Virginia dropped considerably, and the unemployment in the counties in Maryland did not drop very much. And so this raised serious questions as to whether or not there was kind of an equitable distribution going on in those counties right around our nation's capital. Another interesting one we've been able to find with this is we looked at the counties because, and really kind of came out of that review, we looked at the counties with the highest minority population in terms of percentages. So the counties with the highest percentage of minority population, and out of the top 100, we looked at how much they were getting per capita, and 71 of those counties got under the national average of what we were seeing spending. And so it was and some of them strikingly low compared to that national average. And I don't mean to say here that this is as any kind of intentional results. It's as I said, there are data quality problems. So some of this has to be caveated. We aren't able to track all of the money to counties as much as we'd like. And some of this may be more of a systemic result. People have talked about this quite a bit. The loans that went out through banks, there's a real sense that, if you had a good relationship with your bank, then you got in line quicker and you were able to more easily get that money. And so, it's more of a systemic result of the fact that some communities aren't as connected to power, whether it's the financial sector or to the government. And so it's not as easy as saying that the government just decided to be unequitable. It may just be that we poured money into a system that itself was inequitable. And that the money flowed the way that system kind of was set up. We'd love to do more, and we're still working on some other analysis. And we built the tracker to try and give people the tools to do some of their own analysis and some of their own review. I mean, we want sort of a lot of different people trying to figure out what we can realize from this spending.
If you could sort of highlight just in like 2 bullet points the sort of key challenges to getting the information that we need to really assure that the money was going where intended, what would they be, and what are we saying to the Biden administration about what's necessary to respond to that challenge?
So we did a letter to the Biden administration. We really saw that as an opportunity, sort of new people, new approach, and we felt like quite honestly, we couldn't do worse than we were doing under the Trump administration, because, like, as I said, they were dragging their heels at every piece of information, every disclosure, and so we did a letter to them. In that letter, we talked about the county study we did, the 100 highest minority population counties. And we gave them a few things that we thought would be most important. First is just getting that location information for all of the spending. Those stimulus checks that everyone knows about, we don't have that below a state level. So I can't tell you, which counties got more or less, and use the population data we get from census to figure out if some cities or zip codes got less than it looks like they should. They have more people living there or something. And there are other programs where we're not able to follow the money all the way down to a local area. And that's also subawards. We were supposed to do recipient reporting. Anyone who got a large amount of money, over 150,000, was supposed to report back to the government. What did they do with it? How many jobs did they save? And who did they wind up giving the money to in terms of subawards? And this would have allowed us to track the money further, especially for some of the big money going to state agencies for transportation, health, even education, things like that. we don't really get to see. I was talking about that spike in the state capitals. If we got that subaward information and could use it, then we could spread that money out to the states and reduce that spike by showing where the money finally went and wound up. The last thing I would say is I think we need to reform what data we track when it comes to our assistance spending. We do much better job of tracking kind of who's getting money on contracts, but on assistance, I feel like we don't. One of the things that's gotten a lot of talk is the PPP loans that I mentioned earlier, the Paycheck protection loans. We're supposed to go. Congress dictated that they should go to, or I should say, priority should be given to those companies like that are minority, women-owned, veteran-owned, those communities that may have be underserved more traditionally. And we really can't, because of the data we're collecting, we can't really say whether or not we did a good job with that. And it's in part because lending laws prohibit you requiring that information, but that's where the recipient information would have been so useful. We could afterwards certainly ask, what kind of a company are you? Are you minority owned? Are you women owned? And it would be the government asking, not the lender, the private bank. And we could have gotten a much better handle of where that money went. And so we can do better down the road. And if we do, we'll be able to answer these questions with much more certainty and much greater clarity.
I want to go back to something you said, which is, that, there are systemic challenges, but it seems like there are also choices that were made in terms of the former administration holding back our effort to get that recipient information about where it's going, how many jobs are actually being saved with our government money, with the taxpayers' money. And anecdotally, I think we've seen as well that a lot of these small business loans were absolutely going to folks who shouldn't be getting them. So what were some of the things that the administration chose not to do or to do that were undermining our ability to really see how effectively these dollars were reaching the intended communities, the underserved communities, women and veteran-owned small businesses?
I won't go through my whole list because it's a little too long, but I mean, the recipient reporting is definitely one of the most galling to me. Congress specifically said, we want you to do the recipient reporting. And just a few weeks later, the Trump administration's OMB put out a memo that essentially said, we're not going to do it.
Who's the OMB for those who don't know?
I'm sorry, you're right. Acronym, Office of Management and Budget. It's really a kind of implementation right hand of the White House. And so, and they just said agencies don't have to do this. Ignore this requirement under the law. We're still hoping the Biden administration decides to start up recipient reporting.
And that's despite the fact that agencies have a long history of doing that.
Yes.
So they actually reversed a long-standing practice also that we would argue at full legal basis. So
the other big thing I would say is that the Trump administration did that was frustrating was the Paycheck protection loans that we talked about. They came up with a whole new kind of disclosure scheme for them. They said, we'll tell you the recipients of the people who got over 150,000. We'll tell you their name, but not the amount. We're going to report the amounts in ranges, and everyone under $150,000 loan, we'll tell you the exact amount, but we won't tell you their name. It was by far the most bizarre kind of disclosure regime that I've encountered. And basically their excuse was there's some sort of confidential business information that would be revealed if you knew how much these businesses got in terms of loans. And it was such a ridiculous argument. The government does loans every year. As I said, SBA does loans. We do loans after hurricanes, disaster recovery loans. And sometimes there are your rare instance where you have to withhold a name or something like that if it's considered sensitive. But for the most part, this information always comes out. And Pogo sued the administration, and a bunch of media groups sued. And and they lost repeatedly in the courts. We're actually still arguing over.
Lost.
What's that?
The government lost.
The government lost. Yes, we're actually still fighting now with a little bit with the Biden administration over trying to get some additional fields that we think they have. Fields like, particular award IDs or location information. That we've got the names and amounts now, though. That was one of the big things. But as I said, it was at every turn. It felt like they weren't doing it when they had a choice between doing something that would get more accountability and more transparency or less. They always chose the less. And so, we're very hopeful with this new administration that we get a second bite at the apple for some of this reporting. But time's really going to tell.
Can you say a little bit more about that? So we did this letter. What uptake do you think our recommendations are getting? Where are you seeing, besides what you just mentioned, where are you seeing progress? Where are you seeing the need for more to be done? Yeah,
I think we're hearing the right level of interest. That's certainly a good thing. There's something called the Pandemic Response and Accountability Committee. It's a committee of inspectors general throughout the government who they're really kind of internal watchdogs that look for waste, fraud, and abuse all the time. And we put together one of the pieces of legislation we did put together a committee of them to kind of collaborate and work together on tracking this money and looking for waste and fraud. And we've been interacting with them. They're hiring people. Their website is improving quite a bit. I see we just put it up in the link. And they're doing a better job with the data. And from what I hear, they feel like internally people are asking the right questions, and we may see some changes in terms of reporting. The White House also, I should say, has put together a sort of committee itself or a task force around equity when it comes to pandemic spending and vaccine and healthcare. I mean, equity isn't just. I mean, we've been looking at the money, but there are a lot of other equity questions tied up in this pandemic, and so just the fact that they're kind of putting that lens on some of their work is a really good step, and we're hoping that comes over to some of the spending issues that we're talking about.
Thanks. That was really clear. So what's next, Leslie, for the tracker? It seems like we have more exciting opportunities to really see what's happening. What's the tracker going to be up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're still, still working with both of our partners. We actually are planning some new features and new data in the coming months here. So I think that, more broadly, we're feeling really good about the spending side of the site. For the most part, I think there's just only a couple of places that we'd want to keep improving. But we'll be continuing to update throughout the rest of this year in terms of further data as it's either released or as further spending packages are approved. Where we're turning most of our focus to now is really first how we can better match up these indicators of community need in terms of either adding further data. I see there was a question on COVID testing or how we can really get at community or more broadly, how have communities been affected? And also how can we, polish or refine or iterate on the existing modules we have? Sean mentioned earlier that, we currently are only showing 2 figures for unemployment rates. And we're kind of looking to how moving forward and over time can really show, from the beginning of 2020, for example, through to now, how has unemployment been affected, by this spending. The second, and this is a bigger undertaking that we're all really excited about, is we've partnered with Good Jobs First to incorporate some of their data into the tracker. Good Jobs First runs a violations database that, on corporate misconduct that really tracks, where corporations have violated federal regulations or laws. And kind of stepping back a bit, one of the biggest questions we'd gotten both in our user interviews early on and continue to get are what do we know about some of the biggest receivers of these funds? Do the companies that receive these funds have a good track record with federal government? Are they going to be good stewards of taxpayer funds? And so we're really excited to start matching up Good Jobs First's corporate accountability data to really be able to kind of uncover and tease out more of those stories and questions, especially for some of the like biggest receivers or these large corporations that received relief funding.
That's really helpful. And I just want to mention, we probably should have invited our investigative team as well to join this Crowdcast, because as I mentioned right at the beginning, Pogo does a lot of investigations and exposing of abuse and corruption. And we've done a tremendous number of stories about companies who are getting small business loans, who are really, they have, very, massive, already billion-dollar contracts with the government, while also, huge, tremendous instances of employee, abuse and infractions. Some of the investigations exposed how some of these loans are going to tech companies that are actually owned by the Chinese state. So it's perhaps if someone, we call her the good ghost. We have Hallie, who's on production, making sure everything is happening. If someone can post maybe a couple of those articles, for those of you who don't, follow this closely, they're pretty breathtaking. What I want to do now, because we have a good amount of time, is I want to go through some of the questions, actually all the questions that we have, but I'd also really encourage those of you who are listening to just pose any questions that you might have about COVID spending, equity, corruption, abuse. We have tremendous experts here in at Pogo, and we're happy to engage sort of any of those questions. But let's get started. And also to point out to those of you who might not have heard at the beginning, you can upvote people's questions. And everyone's gotten one vote, so it's a four-way tie. So I'm just going to start with the first question. When we see articles exposing disparate funding of CARES money, is that information sourced from this project? I think if I understand the question, it goes to the investigation side. Is like what are journalists? What are the resources that experts and journalists are using to expose these sort of funding inequities?
I'll jump in and say, I think we get our fair share of citations, definitely. We try hard to work with journalists. We just were collaborating with Daily Beast, on something where they were talking about the aid that the COVID aid that companies got, that the people who have been arrested for the insurrection, the Capitol insurrection, the companies they're associated with and the money that went there. And it's kind of an interesting sort of Venn diagram. And so we really do, we try our best to work with the journalists. They do have some other tools, and a lot of this data is public. So some of them are crunching it themselves. They've got their own approach. So it's not always us. And as Leslie said, I think at the very beginning, we weren't trying to build a system that's going to be everything for everyone. It's just so impossible. And so for some people, they're going to need to look at the data differently than the way we're presenting it. And so, there are other trackers out there. So there are plenty of articles that don't cite us.
Got you. We have a question from Palmira. Are the U.S. territories such as Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, and the Pacific territories included in our data collection system?
Yes, but they are unfortunately not on our map. We did just do U.S. states, and so they fall into what's just a non-U.S. state. We have information on as money going to other countries. Some of the COVID relief we're spending, the State Department spending to upgrade, facilities and protect their workers in other countries, or we are giving small amounts of aid to other countries to help them. And so we didn't do a worldwide map because it just proved a little too challenging, and we wanted to try and focus on the United States, and the territories turned out to be something that was a little bit more difficult than we wanted to tackle at the start.
Got it.
If I could also just add to that, though, too, that is actually an area that we have a running list internally of things that, like, you know, due to we were moving very fast in the project, and so there were there were things that we really are excited about that kind of hit the cutting room floor, and this is absolutely on that list in terms of future improvements, and we're continuing to see the site as kind of an iterative process in terms of we're still learning from members on the Hill and from other government staff of what would be most useful to them, and are continuing to see this year as where we can address like further refinements and improvements to our existing modules, those things that we weren't able to get to, and other means of improving them for sure.
Thanks. We have a question from Keisha. We have two. I'm going to ask them one at a time. First of all, thank you, Keisha. She says it's an amazing platform. I agree. And she wanted to know if we've been able to add data around COVID-19 cases or testing. I think you touched on that, Leslie, but if you could sort of draw that out a bit.
I think we're still kind of exploring exactly what that would look like with the vendors in terms of like, it's a little easier from the outset to say this is everything we want to do. Now that we have an existing system, part of it is kind of figuring out like how do we incorporate these other kind of data sources with the existing interface that we have. Mm-hmm. But I think that's the like COVID testing and or cases is definitely an ongoing conversation that we've been having in terms of like how could we incorporate that in a way that would both would match up to the data that we have in a way that felt like methodologically sound also has been some of the challenge, but it's definitely something that's on our stack.
Great, thanks. I'm getting questions in various things. Keisha says we've been answering her questions, but she appreciates the deeper dive. And I think we've also talked about the minority and women-owned business sort of, and to what degree we're able to see whether they've secured government contracts. So that I think we've touched on, although I think it's going to be an ongoing story. Maybe. Sean, can you just sort of mention for those who don't know, like the sort of changes the Small Business Administration has made with the latest relief package?
Sure. And so this is the question was geared towards contracts and some of the changeover has really been around the assistance, the loans. So it's a little bit different. We do have good information around the contracts, and there's always been kind of I think a push at the federal level to contract when you can with small businesses, with minority-owned businesses, all sorts of disadvantaged businesses. But on the assistance side, and particularly again the Paycheck loans, they've made some changes where they are really trying to prioritize. I would say kind of for the first time by working with certain community banks and saying the loans are only available to those community banks at first. And so we're giving them first priority to get in line first. And as I said, in the first few rounds, it was the big banks. It was all sorts of financial institutions rushing to get in line. And now there's a little bit more of a carefully considered approach. We're also trying to do a better job of collecting the data about who's applying. Previously on these applications, we were asking about the ownership, the gender, the ethnicity, the veteran status at the end. Mm-hmm. And now they put that question at the top. Again, because of private lender restrictions, they can't require it. But just that change has seen an uptick in the percentage of people that are giving us an answer, and so it is helping.
Got it. A colleague has asked the question, and I think this one's for Sean or Leslie. Given your expertise on government spending, perhaps there were no surprises for you, but just wondering what surprised you the most when you were putting this database together and eliciting the findings?
That's an interesting question. I mean, there have been a lot of surprises. I think to some extent, one of the real things that surprised me was the fragmentation of the reporting. I think I'd gotten a little comfortable with USA Spending, which is sort of a premier kind of site for the government where we announce our awards and our assistance, and it really is a central site. You don't usually have to go anyplace else to get this information. And suddenly, as Leslie said at one point, we had to realize that we had to pull in data from 5, 6 different sources, spending data, not just the census data or the demographic and the unemployment data, but just to get the spending, like what did we spend and who got it? We were pulling in data from the Federal Reserve. We were pulling in data from HHS. We were pulling in data from Medicaid, from Treasury, and from USA Spending, from SBA, and we had to kind of cobble it together. And I can remember recently being in a discussion with some of the good folks over at the PRAC, the IG committee, and I was asking them, they've made some improvements on their database, and I was talking about getting it all centralized into one spot. And they said to me, we're working on it, but it's very challenging to get all these different pieces of data to fit together. And of course I nodded and I said, yes, it is. And yet we've done it. And I kind of feel like it's incumbent upon the government to rise to that challenge and get it done as well. There should be a central database that we can just start pulling the data. Anyone can start pulling all of the data down from in one place. And so that was probably, for me, the biggest surprise.
Thanks. And a question from Nick. Is Pogo planning on assessing the latest round of PPP loans to see if the Biden administration's announced changes actually succeeded in better directing the funds towards underserved communities?
I think we will be trying to look at that, in terms of, we've got some analysis in the works around PPP loans, and I'm sure we'll be looking at that kind of break of the 2020 loans versus 2021 loans to see if there are changes. I know I've already seen some stuff. Good Jobs First, who we're partnering with, did a piece where they were the ones who saw that we were getting a sort of a higher response rate in the 2021 loans around the ownership questions in terms of gender, ethnicity, and veteran status. And so I think the real question comes again down to, can we really answer? I mean, we have so little data on who is getting this information, even with that uptick. The vast majority, we're still talking about maybe 10% of the loans. Do we know kind of those pieces of information for the borrower? And so when you only have 10%, it's hard to say with any level of certainty as to whether or not we're reaching those underserved communities. And so that's where I think, I don't think we'll be able to reliably answer that question until we get some recipient reporting. That's my judgment. But we are certainly going to, one of the things we've done with this tracker from day one is do everything we can with the data we have. And so we will take the PPP loan stuff, new data, and try and squeeze any conclusions out of it that we can, but I don't know that they'll be definitive.
So I have one question for you, and then I'm going to take the question from Karen. I hope I pronounced your name right. So one question is, if you could talk about what civil society partners we might be working with to identify spending-related topics that need more scrutiny. I'm gonna get nervous here that I miss somebody, but I mean, a few, and we can add more later.
We've already mentioned Good Jobs First in terms of the corporate accountability. There's the sort of money and politics group that looks at campaign contributions, and what's going on there, and whether or not there's any correlation between the spending and campaign contributions. we're definitely working with some groups to look at these equity questions. I'm drawing a blank on a group name, but we work with Public Citizen, American Oversight,
yeah,
Americans for Financial Reform, and this is all just to try and get that who's getting the money and better reviewed. There are a lot of groups working on this, and it's important because when you have this amount of money, no one can get their hands around all of it. You can't, review and analyze all of it. So I wish we had more groups. I really do.
I'd also add that Pogo has been with this tracker supporting research together with the Anti-Corruption Data Collective, the Americans for Financial Reform, and Public Citizen to identify the ways in which private equity, private investment funds are really basically hoarding a lot of this relief funding that was never intended for them because they have obviously long lines of capital that they can access. And while some of these companies are doing the right thing and not, seeing this relief spending as for additional free money for their investments, some are really not. So that's exciting work that Pogo is really helping to fuel. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to bring it down to earth with Karen's question. I hope I'm pronouncing it properly. So the banks with the latest are supposed to. So folks are supposed to be getting a stimulus check now who make a certain amount of money or less, and that money isn't going out yet. Word on the street is that the checks are supposed to go out on the 26th. But the question is, why are these checks being held back? What do the banks gain?
Well, I don't think there's I think a little disconnect there. I mean, there are definitely problems with the stimulus checks. It's not the banks though. The checks come directly from the IRS and Treasury, and so it shouldn't be going through the banks. But even in the first rounds, there were real problems in identifying people to get the checks and getting them out promptly. And so, there are people in poorer communities, rural communities who aren't always filing. This is all based on tax records. And so if you're not filing your tax records or you're moving a lot, it can be hard to get the check to the person. They don't have the direct deposit. They don't have this information. So again, this is this same problem of an inequitable system, a system where there's this digital divide and this kind of difference in terms of the government has a better handle on the households that have made more money and that filed taxes more regularly, exactly where they are, and they got their checks first. And then the households that that move around more, that maybe don't file all the time or don't keep up on it, things like that. Those all created these barriers, and yet those are the households that often needed those stimulus checks more than anyone else. And so there's this huge tension with that problem. And I'm not sure that the Biden administration, even with greater attention to the problem or care about this equity problem, it's not one that's easily solved. It's kind of built into the system. Hopefully, some of the work that the IRS did in the preceding months is something they can build off of, but we'll have to see. If the checks aren't going out and that's the feeling, then that's disappointing.
Just last word, is there going to be a way to overlay our data around spending with data? And I think you touched on this before, Leslie, with data around who's getting vaccinated, where the OSHA complaints are coming from, sort of different versions of how well this COVID response is working for people most affected by the problem.
I think that's what we're trying to explore. I think Sean kind of referenced this a little with how, with PPP data, right? Like if we're only getting, if only 10% of those, recipients are giving this information, it becomes a little more difficult to compare to like the entirety or the rest of it, or to really make any meaningful conclusions from that. So I think what we're really exploring is like, would these overlays, like, is there a reliable source for this information that we can overlay that would be methodologically sound? But it's definitely like in that category of features that we're trying to figure out how we would do that. But yeah, I think that is still something that we're wrestling with. Sean may be able to better speak to the actual data, to be totally honest. But it's certainly, an ongoing kind of like thing that we're really wrestling with.
Thanks. I don't know if you do you want to add to that? Otherwise, I'd like to.
I would just say that she's right that it's challenging. One of the problems we've seen around some of the COVID health data is the fragmentation that states are all reporting it in different ways. So there's not really a great national database. We looked at one of the ones we didn't mention was foreclosures and evictions. And we were very interested in that. And again, there's not a good national database, we found out. And so it becomes a real stumbling block. So it's on our radar. We'll see how well we can do it and whether or not it makes sense for some of the data.
Thanks. I just really want to thank, first of all, everyone who's joined for the Crowdcast, and just encourage you, if you haven't already, to sign up for the weekly spotlight. If you think what Pogo's doing is interesting, it's a very, very, very readable weekly digest of sort of our various attempts to make government more accountable to the public interest, and also our successes, not just attempts. It also highlights all the incredible investigations being done by Pogo. So please do sign up for that. I really especially want to thank as well Leslie and Sean, who just have been doing tremendous work, both setting up this tracker, trying to make it as effective as possible as a tool for real public accountability. And I'm excited to see where you guys go with this. I think you're struggling with all the right questions. And yes, just many thanks, and look forward to getting feedback from all of y'all who have listened in. Have a great day.